Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, thank you for joining us again this evening.
Thank you very much. Should I seize this opportunity to apologize for our absence last week? The problem was on this side, not on your side, but I'm glad to be back uh, on our regular program.
Thank you very much, Prof. We appreciate that. And to our viewers, just before we get into the program, please don't forget, hit that subscribe button so you get the notifications every time we go live. And of course, you can share the link as well with friends who you think may be interested in the program. Prof, let us start this evening by looking at the situation in Guinea. Now, some months back, we talked about the issue of Mali. Mali had experienced two coups in the space of 9 months. And at the time, I asked you this question. I said, is is are we seeing a return to coups in Africa specifically? But of course, we had the situation in Myanmar at the time. Now we have another coup in Guinea. How do you react to this?
Um, it's a pity that human beings don't learn from history, and politicians who seems to be the worst of the sinners. I've often said on this program that we should not start the narrative from the middle. What has precipitated this coup was what happened last year when the incumbent president, then the one who's now been overthrown, got the constitution amended to allow him to run for a third term. And this was an 84-year-old man. Why? This, even if he got the constitution amended, this was against the spirit of constitutionalism and democracy. But he did, and there was blood on the streets of Guinea at that time. This same army that has now turned against him was the same army he directed to shoot at the demonstrators at that time. So, in a way, he carried out, if you like, the first coup against constitutionalism. And this is now another coup, if you like, to, well, not even discuss, but it's another coup to repay him for his own first coup. If he had only learned the lesson that he has served 2 terms as allowed by the Constitution, he should take the final salute and go back to his farm or wherever he came from and allow a new set of politicians to step onto the stage. Maybe there wouldn't be this coup. So, in a way, it's not the fault of the military. I wouldn't blame the military for it. I think it's the politicians who simply refuse to learn the lesson of history. And once they've got away with that coup in Mali, and don't forget also that they got away with the coup in Chad. Um, eh, and of course, you've got the ongoing coup in Myanmar. Well, it then becomes the prince on the horseback, which was a concept in the 60s and the 70s, that the military was a solution to problems of development in low income and middle income countries. However, having just said that, let me quickly amend that to say that what Trump tried to do after he lost the election shows that the high-income countries may also not be immune to the use of armed forces, to restructure the power conundrum in all countries, even though he failed to get away with it. What I said at that time, let me repeat it. It's no use the United Nations or the African Union or ECOWAS condemning the coup without first condemning what I will call the coup against the values of constitutionalism and the values of democratic governance. You shouldn't use the power of the incumbency to amend the Constitution to benefit you. When you do, these three organizations should speak up, because for you to get away with that is then to show that you are encouraging those who then want also to use extra constitutional means to get rid of you.
So let me ask this question. We've talked about Chad, we've talked about Mali, now we're talking about Guinea. Should African leaders be worried right now? And what steps should they be taking to avoid this kind of thing happening? Of course, some of what we could say is, well, lead properly, listen to the people, and things like that. But these things take time to implement. What would you be saying to African leaders today who want to avoid this kind of thing that's now happening? Three African countries in the space of less than 2 years.
No, that's not a bad average. And there are about how many, 50 something African countries, and if three have tripped over the proverbial stone, not a bad average. But what I would tell African countries, and I will bear in mind, I will keep in mind Uganda, that had kept amending the constitution, cracking down the head of the opposition. He's gotten away with it so far. He might not get away with it all the time. And what I will tell African leaders is, you probably will have a patient army and a patient population if you just keep to your term. They may not even mind that you rigged the election for the 2 terms. But the moment they see that they can see the end of your 8 terms, both the army may keep in the barracks and the people may look forward to the next elections. But when the people see that by crook or other means you are prepared to hang on to power, then the people may themselves encourage the military to come in as a solution. One of the African leaders who was, if you like, an expert in coup making, has propounded the doctrine that the military doesn't move until it thinks it has the population behind it to move, that they listen to the heartbeat of the population. And it's when they think the population is so disgruntled and has given up on the government of the day and is looking at them that they actually move out of the barracks against the government. But if that is true, then the politicians, the political leaders should just serve their term and leave.
Someone is saying here on YouTube, and I think agreeing with you, that it seems that the misrule and high-handedness really contributes to what we're seeing in the overthrow of African leaders. But I want to put another question to you before we leave this topic. So we've talked about, well, rule appropriately, govern appropriately, and then you're less likely to run into these kind of issues. And these are the sort of preventative measures that we've talked about. But when we then go into after the fact, and we start to look at what has happened, even with Mali, ECOWAS came up. ECOWAS talked about sanctions. Here again, we're hearing sanctions, suspension of Guinea from its membership from ECOWAS. What exactly should the international community do to help return to democratic rule?
Yeah, the international community has done what is expected of it. They've made the right noises. Um, um, they have suspended um, Guinea from ECOWAS, which will amount to nothing. And they've gone through the moves they're supposed to go through. And then we are going to go into negotiations. And we will probably have a replay of the Mali experiment, where there'll be an understanding that, all right, after 1.5 years, we'll go back to barracks, or we will look for a civilian who is clean and make him a figurehead president. I mean, that will be understood by everybody, because the military that put him there will be dictating. Where problem will come, as it came in Mali, is where the president forgot that it was the military that put him there and started flexing his muscles. So that's the kind of a package, that will be worked out. I will still be interested in the position of France, because France supported the former president's tenure extension. They supported it. So are they going to oppose this present regime, or will France have now learned from its experience in Mali that it simply cannot afford another military engagement um, um, in Africa or in any other part of the world, for that matter, and therefore join ECOWAS or use ECOWAS as the front for making some comfortable arrangement where it will have taken a principled position and then deal with realism, political realism, as the case may be.
There is a question here, and I think it will be a good point to start to look at Afghanistan post the exit of the United States. But one thing this person has highlighted here, this comment is from YouTube. Political scientists should begin to conceive a new paradigm of governance. Now, we're seeing what has happened in Afghanistan, and you, sir, have raised it so many times that maybe we need to start to rethink what we call democracy and whether or not that, in fact, is the standard of governance. You've raised this in the past. But Prof, how do you respond to that comment before we start to look at Afghanistan and how governance is being put forward in Afghanistan?
Well, actually, if you look at the literature uh, and one uses the country I'm familiar with, Nigeria, as an illustration, as far back as the 70s. Azikwe, who was the former ceremonial president of Nigeria, did propose a diarchy between civilians and the military as a transitional form of governance from the military to the political class. Of course, it was shut down, and I laugh when I think about it now, because the problem also with our intellectuals in Africa is being on the periphery. We are so much influenced by the thinking amongst scholars at the core in London, in Washington, in New York. And of course, if you are of the socialist class, the thinking of the scholars in Peking or in Moscow. So anything that is then outside that, anything that is outside that parameter is looked askance, rather than being examined on its own merit. Then you also had some scholars, when they were looking at the party system, advocating a no-party system. I'm quite aware of this, and that party systems tend to exacerbate the structural problems that you have in a developing society. So many times in giving lectures, I had drawn attention of my audience to the fact that neither in Britain nor in the United States did they start with a democratic system as we know it today. When the United States became independent, in spite of the highfalutin principles that they enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to vote was limited to the property class. Workers were not allowed to vote. Women were not allowed to vote. Native Americans were not allowed to vote. Blacks were not allowed to vote. It was a limited property class that decided the parameters of American independence. And gradually, as they opened it up to allow more voters to come in, they had already decided on the elite, the characteristics of the elite that will rule the country. So you didn't just have the vote and you could spread it anyhow. They've already, and if you look at the first 6 American presidents, they were all property classes. I mean, they belonged to the property class. They were not merchants. They belonged to the property class. Whereas in our case, in the case of low income and medium income countries, they expected you to practice this democracy when there has been no consensus on which that democracy would be based. And that is why somebody asked a Chinese gentleman once the basis of Chinese phenomenal growth. And he said, we went from being a monarchy to the dictatorship of the Communist Party. From the dictatorship of the monarchy to the dictatorship of the Communist Party. We didn't fool around with one man, one vote, when we knew how so fractured Chinese society was. It was governance and value making from the top and nothing from the bottom. And so when some of us advocated a no-party system in the 70s and in the 80s, again, something which the intellectual class, looked up askance and shut down, we were saying a party system operating within a highly fractionalized country, you are just going to have parties formed or formalized along these structures. It's not going to build up unity. On the other hand, it's simply going to enhance the disunity. Now, some looking at that then I said, let's try a 2-party system rather than a multi-party system. A 2-party system will force all tendencies to coagulate within those 2 parties. Again, has that worked? I am not too sure. So we are now faced in the 21st century with what I will call the dilemma of governance. What is the system that best addresses the problems, the structural problems of our country? Even the United States, we've discussed it on this program. After you've lined, even up till today, after you've lined up to vote and what have you, they then have the Electoral College. So you have the case of Mrs. Clinton, who beat Trump when he came to the direct vote by about 3 million votes, but lost in the electoral college. Now, was that democracy or democracy American style? So to me, the debate is now really fully open. And I don't think there will be any intellectual class that will then leap up and start, mouthing what I will call, the centralist systems, or mouth the systems that are embedded in the civilizations of the West.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's go to Afghanistan. They have clearly, the Taliban has come out and they've, in a sense, said we are following a different law in terms of how we govern the country. And quite significantly, in the course of the week, the Taliban has now announced a government. And created a problem, I would imagine, for not just the United States, but for the West in general, when we look at the composition of that leadership team, as you would call it. How do you respond to what is happening in Afghanistan with regards to the formation of this new cabinet?
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. The Taliban fought a war. They won the war. And you now want to dilute their victory by telling them, bring in the people who didn't fight the war, bring in the people who fought against you. Come on. Would the United States do that? Would China do that? Which country will fight a war, win the war, and then sit back and decide to dilute their victory? People seem to forget that the Taliban was an ideological group. We seem to want to demean them by saying it was a religious group. Fine. A religious group based on deep religious ideas. That was what drove them and kept them going for 20 years. In fact, that's why the most powerful country in the world could not defeat them. That was also why the second most powerful country in the world at that time, the Soviet Union, could not defeat them. And you now think they would dilute what drove them for 20 years by forming a national-based government. If they are sensible, I would expect them to bring in professionals who will help them run, because governance has become a very professional, depends very much on a professional attributes. It's no longer a village affair. So in a way, one can argue with the Taliban on that basis. But I would think that there are people who will be telling the Taliban, first of all, consolidate your victory. And I think that's also what they were saying by saying, number one, this is an acting government. It's not the real government. And that there are several other posts that have not been filled. But we have filled the posts that to allow governance. There is a point I want to make, very fundamental in looking at the narrative on Afghanistan. Not too many people know that Afghanistan was a monarchy before all this mess started. They had a Shah of Afghanistan. And a few days ago, I was even looking at pictures of the king of Afghanistan visiting Britain and being received by Queen Elizabeth. So we are not talking about 1800 and something. We're talking about 1950, thereabouts. That's number one, the first point I want to make. The second point is, actually, it was the king of, one of the kings of Afghanistan who introduced education for women and girls in Afghanistan. Not the Americans, not in the past 20 years. It was one of the kings. And it was also one of the kings who delivered a sermon that there's nowhere in the Quran where women were asked to wear the hijab or the veil. And on the basis of that, his queen publicly removed her veil. And Afghanistan women followed her by removing their veil and what have you. So it wasn't the West who introduced women education, girls education into Afghanistan. It was an Afghan king who did so. So we should really change the narrative, and maybe to make it even easier for the Taliban to accept, because the Taliban also have this fixation that they are fighting Western civilization. Fine. If you then, you yourself or we ourselves now change the narrative that the education for women, women working was not introduced by the West. It was actually introduced by you, Afghanistan, through your king. It may even be easier for the Taliban to accept that. When the Americans overthrew the Taliban after 9/11, the king who had been in exile in Italy came back and was very warmly received. And there was some talk at that time about restoring the monarchy. Since the monarchy will be seen by all the groups in Afghanistan, as the focus of the country. The United States vetoed that idea because, again, I think the American Revolution against the monarchy in Britain is still runs in the blood of Americans. They vetoed it, but the man remained in Afghanistan and was given the title Father of the Nation. And he died and is buried in the palace in Afghanistan. His son, who is the heir to the throne, lives in Maryland in the United States. Actually, he's a poet. He's not a playboy. He's a poet. Now, have they thought of a role for him? People have to think outside the box in dealing with the Taliban rather than preaching to them if the Taliban government, I mean, there's a saying that we should be careful about what we pray for, because if we get it, we may actually be asking for more problems. Look at this whole issue now about the Taliban not allowing those chartered planes to take off. And the Secretary of State of the United States keeps saying those planes must take off. Those planes must take off. And the Taliban is saying not all these people have documents. Supposing the Taliban say, all right, anybody wants to get on those planes could get on those planes and they could take off, but we will not take them back. And you then discovered that ISIS and Al-Qaeda had planted people on those inside those planes. They were not bona fide people who fought on the side of the Americans. Then what? How do you then deal with those people? And yet you are going in with the mantra, those planes must take off, those planes must take off. And Taliban said they can take off, but not all the people who want to embark have any documents to prove their identity. So Afghanistan has a very interesting mosaic that we should look at, and we should stop this one narrow narrative, being run from the West, as if the West came in as salvation for Afghanistan. No, it's not true.
So let me pick on an important point that has come up following the situation we saw in Afghanistan. This is a comment that was supported by President Macron, where he called for a separate EU army to help tackle the kind of issue that happened in Afghanistan. Do you see that being a viable thing to do?
Theoretically, it sounds attractive, but the way you've posed your question is not viable. The EU doesn't have a common foreign policy. How could you have a common EU army? The basis of the European Union was an economic foundation to avoid conflicts in Europe, to avoid the kinds of misunderstanding or the kind of rivalry between France and Germany that led to World War I and World War II. That was the underlying basis of the EU. Now, after the Second World War, the Americans then provided the strategic and military building blocks, because the danger was no longer from Germany, the danger was from the Soviet Union. Now, as long as that remained, you need an enemy on which you will focus in designing a military institution and a strategic doctrine. Who will be the enemy to the European Union? If it is Russia, they alone cannot, in isolation of the United States, take on Russia. If it is China, China is not focusing on Europe unless Europe now wants to provoke China. Now that China is restructuring Asia in order to, if you like, dismantle the post-Second World War structure that was put in place at the time when China was nothing. Even if it is that, the European Union can still not take on China unless in collaboration with the United States. So, see this, the concept of a European army comes up from time to time when there is a dissonance between the United States and Europe. But that should not mean one will avoid the intricacies of building a military establishment, and what will be the capacity of that military establishment in tackling what the establishment is supposed to tackle. So that's why I said it sounds right. But in terms of practical application, Europe is not that united as we may think. Even over something as, if you like, as not small, but as little as the COVID-19, look how long it took the European Union to say, we are approving this vaccine, we are approving that vaccine, long after the United States and even the United Kingdom had already approved, because you must get the approval of each member state in the European Union. They cannot have a common refugee policy. Countries like Greece, Italy complain that they are bearing the burden of refugees, and that once those refugees land there, the rest of Europe doesn't want to share their burden. They cannot have a common foreign policy until each one of them had approved. If they are going to be, they shouldn't confuse being European Union with being Union of European States. Those are two totally different things, which they are, when the Americans first got their independence, what did they set up? It was a confederation of the 13 colonies, and then they discovered that that wasn't going to work, and quickly now had another conference to now have a United States of America. So I think that the European Union will first of all have to transmute into Union of European States before they can start to talk about a common army and a common foreign policy.
So next week, 2 days away, we're going to be facing another anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Now we're talking about the US pulling out of Afghanistan. Have we actually won this war on terror? That was really the reason why the US went into Afghanistan in the first place. Are we any safer now, 20 years on?
No, if by we you mean the whole world. There are still remnants of ISIS in Iraq. There are still remnants of ISIS in Syria. There are still remnants of Al Qaeda and ISIS in even in Afghanistan, and it was ISIS-K that was responsible for killing the 13 American servicemen and servicewomen at the tail end of the evacuation. We have ISIS in West Africa. We have ISIS in North Africa. So how can we, and don't forget, we have, whether it's Al Qaeda or ISIS cells, I don't know, in Europe. In Europe. Yesterday, the trial in France of those responsible for, if you remember, the series of bombing explosions in France in 2015, I think, had just started just yesterday. So you can't say that the world is safer now. I think what the United States can say is that there has been no terrorist activity in mainland United States orchestrated from abroad. There is, as we found out after Trump lost the election, there is internal terrorism in the United States itself. There are terrorist cells, but not linked with groups abroad. But in Europe, there are terrorist cells linked with group abroad. In Africa, there is. In the Middle East, there is. So we are not, and I think we shouldn't lull ourselves into a false sense of security that the war has been won. The war against terrorism has not been won. Even in Germany, in Germany, in Italy, the right-wing fascist groups are resurfacing. So you may be focusing on one terrorist manifestation while ignoring other terrorist manifestation. And you can't keep your eye off the ball at any time. It's like playing football. The attack could come from the wings, from the middle, from a ball played from the back. You've got to keep your eye on the ball all the time. And most of governments don't show a capability of chewing gum and walking at the same time. They just seem to have this capability of focusing on one source of terrorism while ignoring other sources until they are caught off the balance.
One question I want to put to you relates to Qatar. In the last few weeks, Qatar has been somewhat a somewhat strategic location for the negotiations with the Taliban and the United States. And in fact, one of the negotiators in Qatar during the Taliban takeover is now the foreign minister in the new Afghanistan cabinet that's just been announced. Do you see the profile of Qatar rising as a result of this activity that is taking place there?
If I were wearing a hat, I would say I doff my hat to the professionalism of the political elite in Qatar. They have played their game admirably, using the peculiarities of Qatar to their own advantage. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, the largest United States base in the Mediterranean is in Qatar. So already Qatar has a special relationship with the United States. When Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and there's another country decided to blockade Qatar, economic blockade against Qatar on the grounds that Qatar was giving aid and comfort to those behind the Arab Spring, and that Qatar was also close to Iran. I mean, that must show you how clever they are. They are close to the United States and they are close to Iran as well. And there was some talk about Saudi Arabia invading Qatar. Qatar was able to actualize its close relationship with the United States as a shield to protect it from the Arab blockade. And finally, after 3 years or so, the Arabs had to lift, or the Arab countries had to lift their blockade because they were not getting anywhere. Instead, the profile of Qatar, was rising. So the professionals in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, and in the monarchy had shown considerable professionalism in raising the imposition in Qatar in such a way as to what Qatar had gained was protection. Protection. Its status in the world is by far beyond its tiny population and its own geographical status. You know, that takes brains to do that. It's not a question of just fixing on one ideology, shouting yourself hoarse all the time. It has a Commonwealth Finance Fund because it is an energy producing country. But instead of wasting all the money it has made, it set up a Commonwealth Fund which cushioned it against the economic blockade which Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and I said there's a third country imposed against it. And now, rather than joining in the negativism against the Taliban, it offered the United States something which other countries in the Middle East could not offer them, which is an avenue to talk to the Taliban without undermining their own status. And kudos to the professionals in Qatar. Kudos to them.
So let's end with Somalia. The two most powerful leaders announced different people as the head of its intelligence arm. Are we about to see Somalia descend into another series of unrest?
You asked me a question once about the last Afghan government. And I said the childish games which the Afghan political elite played did not allow a unified civil service, did not allow for a unified military establishment to be formed. Again, politicians don't learn. Now that you have the president in Somalia and the prime minister going separate ways, who would the army obey if the country is attacked by the militia which exists? Somalia, speaking the same language, having the same religion, has not been stable for over 20 years. It's been attacked and destabilized by the militia. And now from inside, the disconnection between the prime minister and the president is doing the work of the militia for it. All the militia needs to do is to wait and then pick up the pieces when the government collapses from the inside due to the power struggle, the power grab. The two of them cannot see that they have a common enemy and that therefore they should have they should reach an agreement, look for a middle ground, but instead each one is flexing its muscle. At the end of the day, you discover that they have no muscle. It's the militia that will then just step in. And disgusted really by the childishness of leaders, of political leaders, who must have it their way or no way. Well, the Somalis will soon find out that there are alternatives, standing in the wings. It's a pity for Africa.
Thank you for that, Prof. We've actually run out of time now. However, there was a question I was going to ask, which I will defer till next week. And it is this issue of the United Kingdom choosing to send an aircraft carrier to what they've called the west coast of Africa. And according to the commander, one of the commanders of the ship, they've said 2/3 of the world is our playground. I'd like to start with that next week. Is the UK really still a superpower, able to make such claims? We'll start with that next week, sir, if that's okay with you.
Yes, yes. Thank you for an interesting week. This session. I'll look forward to picking up on your last point next week.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you to our viewers for joining us this evening. We'll be back again next week, same time. Please, if you haven't already subscribed, hit the subscribe button on YouTube. So as soon as we go live the next time, you will get the notification that we are live. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next week.